Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Alyssa Karpinka, and I'm the event coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. This event is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. Just to note that this event is being live streamed to our YouTube page, so please be aware of the webcam behind you. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of The Magic of Rogues, Necromancers in Early Tudor England by Frank Klaassen and Sharon Hubbs-Wright, and Everyday Magicians, Legal Records and Magic Manuscripts from Tudor England by Sharon Hubbs-Wright and Frank Klaassen. Thank you to Frank and Sharon for being here tonight. I'd also like to thank Penn State University Press and University of Toronto Press Distribution for helping us make this event possible. Frank Klaassen is a professor of history at the University of Saskatchewan. He is the author of Making Magic in Elizabethan England, 2 early modern vernacular books of magic, and the award-winning The Transformations of Magic, Illicit Learned Magic in the Later Middle Ages and Renaissance, both published by Penn State University Press. Sharon Hubbs-Wright is a professor of history at St. Thomas More College and director of classical, medieval, and Renaissance studies at the University of Saskatchewan. She has published numerous articles on late medieval, social, and legal history. We will now hear from Frank and Sharon. Please give them a warm welcome.
Thanks everyone for coming out. It's overwhelming and heartwarming turnout. So we're really excited. Thanks so much to Alyssa Karpinka and to McNally Robinson for hosting this event. It's a huge service to the community, and we really appreciate it. I should also begin with a altogether too short set of thanks as well. To Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, University of Saskatchewan, and St. Thomas More College, and our wonderful colleagues at both STM and Generalist, who are here, and also the Department of History. We're very grateful for the support we've had over the years. To tell a rounded story about practitioners of magic in Tudor society, you need the ability to look at 2 really quite different sources. The manuscripts of practicing magicians will tell you about how to conduct magic rituals, about the myths magicians attributed to themselves, these kinds of things. And this is my area of expertise. But if you want to know about magicians' relationships with their neighbors, their roles in society, who and what kinds of people they were, how society dealt with them, and so forth, you need to examine the only other major record of real practitioners, and that is legal records. And this is Sharon's area of expertise. So in these books, we provide you with translations of legal records of practitioners who've got in trouble with authorities or are mentioned in legal cases. These are paired with examples of the magic they performed from magicians' handbooks from the period. And of course, we provide extensive introductions to help you make sense of it all. One of the results of this exercise is some myth busting. We have a tendency to think about these kinds of magicians through the lens of 19th century romantic mythologies about witchcraft and the witch trials. And these hold that pre-modern magic practitioners, mostly women, practiced magic that was a kind of pre-Christian religion, and that they were targets of the witch trials, which subsumed all of Europe in a kind of frantic craze of witch hunting. The real picture is different. As horrific and as unjust as the witch trials were, they tended to be very localized, and there were very few or none at all in many areas in Europe. In areas like England, real magic practitioners were treated relatively leniently, usually only doing public penance if they got in trouble with the law. And finally, in areas where there were extensive trials, such as in England and Essex, the real magic practitioners account for only about 2 to 3% of those accused of witchcraft, which is not what you would expect. The question is, why? This is because if you wanted to get someone to perform magic for you, and more to the point perhaps, if you were going to pay someone to do magic for you, you wanted to be sure that you could trust them. This is to say, the real practitioners of magic were far more likely to be trusted members of the community and were almost never reported to the authorities. These were commonly referred to in England as cunning folk, And there were tens of thousands of them literally operating in Europe at any time, any given time in pre-modern Europe. These folks are well represented in these books. So too, however, are people who just weren't careful. And also on other people who were downright con artists. So it's a complicated group. What we're going to do now is read a few passages from the books to give you a sense of what they're like. And the first is from The Magic of Rogues. It describes a fateful, cold and bleary night when, after months of preparations, a group of men in Yorkshire went out to seek buried treasure with the assistance of conjured demons. The portable parchment conjuring circle they used is probably very much like this one right down here, which is reproduced from a 16th century magic manuscript and is also in the book.
All the collected evidence agrees that the 9 men met at the house of Otwell and Haig in Bingley to make their attempt on the treasure on Monday, January 28th, 1510. A good deal of preparation remained to be done. Thomas Wood said the priest performed 2 masses, and later in the day he made confession to his master, Richard Greenwood, to protect himself from the demons. It is likely that all the men heard mass and confessions in a similar manner, something that is typically required in necromantic handbooks. Stewart took responsibility to gild the scepter, that is, to apply gold leaf to it. The priest, who had arrived with a large bag of equipment, probably including a magic crown and certainly a portable altar and holy water sprinkle, hurriedly copied consecrations from a mass book for their operations. When all was prepared, they decided to leave the house in small groups so as not to arouse suspicions in the town. They would all meet some miles to the south on the moor at Solon End, most likely modern Soil Hill, at sunset. The night was a complete debacle. Only Thomas Wood and his master, Richard Greenwood, made it to the rendezvous point, as both were from the area, and Richard seems to have been regarded as the guide. This makes sense. Although Solon End is a high point of land and easily visible under normal circumstances, a great mist came up. This would have accelerated the coming of darkness and blocked any moon or even starlight. As a result, the others spent the night wandering around on the moor at Bradford Dale Head. First, they ended up at a small town called Cockham, where they got fire for their torches and salt to make holy water. Then they wandered around looking for the cross, where they seemed to have thought the treasure was located. They went to a cross at Michaelmas, the wrong one, and paid a local to help them find the other, but to no avail. Not only was the night an uncomfortable and frustrating failure, but Richardson also lost the holy water sprinkle somewhere on the moor. Eventually, Wilson and Knowles were sent to get horses and bring them back to Cockham for Stewart, Wilkinson, and Jameson. By this point, another plan was being hatched. They would meet in Arden Wood near Bingley, and Wilkinson would have the treasure brought to them by the spirit Belfares.
We were on a podcast out of New York for this book, and the interviewer described it as something like a Coen Brothers movie, which is not inappropriate. So what got these men in trouble was how reckless they were. Everyone found out, and they were eventually arrested and tried in the court of the Archbishop of York. The magicians in this group, 2 priests and 1 grammar school teacher, performed necromancy, that is, demon conjuring. This was an old tradition of learned magic created in the 12th and 13th centuries based on Arabic jinn magic and written in Latin. And we provide a variety of texts illustrating this art in the book. In this next passage from Everyday Magicians, we describe another example of a magician using learned magic. He was a con man who went by the name of Wisdom. Our story recounts his escapades with the young and foolish nobleman, the name of Harry Neville.
Harry Neville's confession reveals him to be a typical instance of the spoiled and bored rich kid. He was young, idle, unhappy in marriage, and the heir apparent of the Earl of Westmoreland. According to his own confession, he led a dissipated life of gambling and whoring, or as he put it, of play and dally-do. Due to his strong prospects, Neville also had easy access to loans. Like many in his position, he amassed considerable debts. He was first seduced into the world of magic with a promise from the magician Gregory Wisdom, who would make him a ring and bring him success at the gambling tables. After several months of living in Neville's house, Wisdom finally produced the ring. Initial success in gambling convinced Neville of Wisdom's abilities, but he quickly began to lose money again. He claims in his letter of confession to have had growing concerns about his lack of success, but he still went on to pay for a magic operation to make him a great musician and gave Wisdom funds for a treasure hunting expedition to his father's lands in the north. Despite Neville's vociferous claims to the contrary, he seems to have supported Wisdom's project of killing his wife and father by magic. We know this from a subsequent letter where he admits to this, but claims to have been convinced by Wisdom that death by magical means was not so bad because his wife would certainly go to heaven. Doesn't mention the father. Predictably, none of this magic worked. Wisdom was a better con artist than the magician. And by the time he had finished with the young nobleman, Neville had lost a considerable sum of money and was in jail, probably for debt, and was additionally suspected of plotting to use magic to bring about the death of his wife and father, who was a peer of the realm. This was treason, plain and simple, but like most of those who found themselves in trouble with the authorities for practicing magic in this period, even treasonous magic, he was eventually released, and although chastened, was still ultimately able to take up his father's title. Remarkably, Wisdom also evaded prosecution and went on to refashion himself as a physician. His skill as a con artist no doubt served him well in this profession, and he ultimately managed to get a license from the College of Medicine.
The ritual Wisdom came up with to make Harry Neville into a great musician involved conjuring the god Orpheus, with using a device which was modeled on this one right here, which is the Holy Almond Doll, and it's a device for speaking with angels. You can come up and have a look at it afterwards, although I'm probably not allowed to light it in here, especially because we have to put some incense underneath to make it work. All the cases we've talked about so far involved only men, and they are typical forms of magic associated with men: treasure hunting and gambling magic. Men, particularly clerics, also had easier access to the Latin texts of learned magic. So then what about women at this period? When women got in trouble for magic, their cases did not receive the same kind of careful attention as those involving men. And the records tend to be shorter. And if you want more about, about why that is, you can read books. Still, we have some very interesting cases. In one of my favorites, two women in rural Somerset confessed to making a girdle designed to get their stubborn cow to go back into the barn, which didn't work, incidentally. They also talk about two much better local cunning folk probably trying to exculpate themselves a little bit. One by the name of Christina and her father, who were able to cure animals through the use of charms. But we've got a limited amount of time, so we're going to turn to a different one. Nazareth Jarbree worked as a scryer, that is, one who looked into a crystal beryl stone, or a crystal or beryl stone or a mirror to see spirits. And this was a form of learned magic, and so her presence there is interesting and somewhat unusual. Nazareth is also interesting because plenty of people have noticed this case, but uniformly follow a 19th century description of the case, which calls her a man. In fact, Nazareth was a woman's name, And no one seems to have looked at the original Latin, which makes it quite clear that she was a woman. In this record of her presentation at court, Nazareth describes the vision she saw of the theft. The man whose goods had been stolen then claimed to recognize the thief she described as a woman called Lockbell.
1476. Nazareth Jarvey, on the 22nd day of February, appeared before the commissary at the official's chambers, and after taking an oath to tell the truth, she confessed that she was at Westminster with Thomas Barley in Tuttle Street. After Thomas said certain prayers, she looked into a barrel stone, and the first time she saw in it a man in certain clothes who carried a box with pearls, stones, and other things that had been stolen furtively from his mother's house. And again, at the request of the cleric of the Church of St. George, once more she went to the home of the same Thomas, and there similarly she saw a man and a woman in certain clothes which she did not recognize. And after she described the dress and the appearance of the people, the cleric of St. George said that he knew the woman, and she was named Mama. And Nazareth, neither did nor said anything else, and the case was carried over 8 days.
We're going to talk a little bit more about theft magic in a moment, or magic to discover or identify thieves. But let's turn to love magic, a form of magic which is commonly assumed to be women's magic. In fact, it seems to have been performed by men and women in roughly equal numbers, and for men and women in roughly equal numbers. Our book includes a number of cases. The case of a bawd, kind of a madam for prostitutes, accused of love magic by the men who were fighting over her. Two women accused of procuring good marriages for young women through magic. And also the case of Thomas Fansom, who peddled love charms in Canterbury. But we want to read you some examples of the magic texts. So let's turn to an example for love, an operation for love. One of scores of similar magic operations from a handbook that was quite clearly compiled by a man. For love. Take virgin wax from the bees at the time the moon is not at full by a week or more, in other words, on a waxing moon, which is conventional. And keep the wax until next Friday, and that day make thee a candle in the hour of Venus, and write about it with the blood of thy little finger these names of spirits. Then write the woman's name whom thou desirest. First write Alafe, then the woman's name. Then next write Barathies, and thereafter the woman's name. Then thrice Obethies, and the woman's name. Then write Ariax, then the woman's name. After all this, say this. I conjure you, gods, which were sent into the closed vessel that Solomon did seal. I adjure you by the womb of the Virgin and by all the things which are under heaven, or that be in heaven contained, that you may make her obey. Which conjuration being said, light the candle quickly, and put it out again, and bear it to the church, and secretly put it under a stone in the church, that it cannot be seen, and let it remain until the priest be gone home. Then come back again, take the candle up, and put it under your armhole, till some of your sweat and heat be thereon. And then say in this manner, even as this candle is made hot by my heat, so likewise let her be made by my love. Then if she be near, she will send a message to Nicholas. So curiously, this kind of magic was actually very rarely found its way into the courts. By contrast, the detection of thieves was very common indeed. So we'll start with a passage from Everyday Magicians that explains why this is the case.
Theft was an enormous problem in pre-modern society, and English legal historians have found that property offenses made up nearly 3/4 of the felonies prosecuted in early modern secular courts. Given the prevalence of theft, it should come as no surprise that magic for identifying thieves or stolen goods was an everyday activity of cunning folk and very frequent in both manuscripts and legal documents. Many people turned to magic when their goods were stolen. The close-knit nature of late medieval and early modern communities meant that accusing someone of theft through the courts was complicated. Many victims of theft and those they suspected knew one another and were bound together in various ways, either as master and servant, friends and family, or neighbors living in the same parish. Theft of an item worth 12 pence or more, which is grand larceny, was a felony punishable by hanging. As much as someone might hate their thieving neighbor, making a formal accusation was complicated. It must have been hard to feel responsible or to be blamed by other members of your community for bringing about a person's death. In his study of crime in parishes, James Sharp found that pressure could be placed on complainants to reduce the claim value of stolen goods to 11 pounds or less, which was only petty larceny, in order to save the life of a locally known thief. An additional disincentive for resorting to the courts to prosecute a thief was the almost certain loss of the stolen item, especially before 1529, because a guilty verdict resulted in the forfeiture of the stolen goods to the crown. It wasn't returned to the individual. In light of both pre-modern community life and the inflexibility of the common law, the frequent resort to magical theft detection is much easier to understand. Paying a cunning person surely cost less than court fees and did not risk the major social disruption that a hanging might provoke.
What this demonstrates is the way in which magic served a very important social function in Tudor society. It offered a kind of controlled expression of anger, a way of expressing your suspicions with some support of local people, and a kind of extra legal self-help or folk law. So if it was useful to people, and if people trusted their magicians, why did it end up in the courts? Mostly this was because it brought about some kind of social disruption, as is illustrated in this case.
1497. John White is charged because in the parish of St. Mary Magdalene in Old Fish Street, he employed the magic and prohibited art of psalter and key by saying certain uses of the psalter. Through the said art, he sought for 1 silver spoon from the goods of John Ryan, and through the said art, he accused Elizabeth Dolan as though she were guilty of the theft of the said spoon. Because of White's allegations, Elizabeth's husband forced her from the house and from his fellowship, and he beat her. The 26th of April, the said John White appeared and confessed that he had been hired by the wife of John Ryan for 8 pence to look for the said stolen object with the psalter and key, by saying the verse, "If you saw the thief," and inserting the name of the said Elizabeth into the key. Because the key turned and the book with the said name, this John judged that Elizabeth was the culprit.
So then how was this magic performed? We're gonna shift here in our presentation from text to an actual demonstration of the key and psalter method. If anybody wants to conjure vagaries, you'll have to buy the book and do that at home. And I would not use the circle. It's not, it would be the printer was not consecrated, nor was the ink, nor is the paper. So it probably will not work. So, all right, we've arranged for a volunteer to help us with this. Stand back there and I'll look over here. All right, so a couple of things you need to know to begin with. The first is that this is a medieval key, and medieval keys are a tube that's open at the end. You can come look at it afterwards if you want. And what they would do is they would roll up the name of the person they thought was guilty, and you poke it inside the key like that. You'd then take that key and you'd clamp it in a psalter. Okay, this is a book of Psalms, and like all medieval books, they would have usually 2 or 3 hasps on it keep the parchment nice and tight so that it didn't swell up or the paper, and to protect the book and keep it in good nick. And so it would hold that key in place like that, right? This would be laid in the Psalter on the 50th Psalm, which mentions a thief, and I'll read in a moment. Then it would be passed to the people who were trying to sort this out. The magician would probably, in Latin, conduct some kind of, in nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti, or some kind of brief invocation like this, and then would read the psalm read this passage, and I will read from the King James Version. But unto the wicked God saith, what hast thou to do to declare my statutes, or that thou shouldest take my covenant in thy mouth, seeing thou hadst instruction, and casteth my words behind me? When thou sawest a thief, then thou consented with him, and hast been partaker with adulterers. Thou givest my mouth to evil, and thy tongue frameth deceit. Thou sittest and speakest against thy brother. Thou slanderest thy own mother's son. These things hast thou done, and I kept silent. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether such a one as thyself, but I will reprove thee, and set them in order before thine eyes. Now consider this, ye that forgot God, lest I tear you to pieces, and there be none to deliver.
Perfect.
Oh. Guilty.
That's exactly. Well done.
The poor man's ritual, there's a poor man's version of this, which interestingly may have been the foundation for it, which involves using a sieve and clamping a set of shears on top of that. So this is attested actually all over Europe that people use this one. So there is another possibly earlier version of that. So that concludes the formal part of our presentation. We are happy at this point to take any questions that you might have. And we're going to talk about the books, and we'll certainly be here afterwards to talk with any of you about that. Sit down.
So these seem to be secular courts that you're talking about here for the most part. Maybe I might be wrong. I'm wondering if the ecclesiastical courts have any say in something that feels like kind of on the margins of acceptable religious.
So most of the stuff that we read tonight comes from the ecclesiastical.
Oh, okay.
Right, so the Archbishop's Court at York, where the 9 men who were looking for the Mixendale treasure came from. And they were conjuring, well, one of them was a cunning man who they knew about, but they had priests also from local monasteries. They seem to have a pretty big collection of magic books, which they were using along with a circle like this one to conjure vagaries to get that very treasure out. And then the other short passages that we read, I think they all came from the text that you read was not.
That's correct. The magic, the William Neville case.
Neville case was secular.
And was in secular courts. And there's another Neville actually in the first book who gets involved, who gets embroiled in predictions about the death of Henry VIII, and Thomas Cromwell ends up arresting him actually and throwing him to the Hooskow and interrogating him. But turns out he was a buddy of Thomas Cromwell's or a friends of the family or something, and so he walked free too.
Thank you.
You mentioned the circle needing to be like blessed. Like how hard would that have been to be done in the times?
That's a lovely question. In fact, there's a lot of details in the Mixendale treasure hunting story where these guys actually have to get what they think is virgin parchment, which is basically parchment that's never been touched before. And it's actually difficult to get their hands on. And so they do manage to get this. They get it through sort of a second cousin once removed who gets them this stuff. After that, yes, you have to write on it. And to get it consecrated, they had priests. So there were 3 priests in that group who actually did the job of consecrating the magic circle for them. So, but a very useful thing because you didn't have to go through the trouble of trying to scrabble this on the ground someplace, which could be a problem if it's out in the heather and rocks on the moor. So to be able to just like pop this parchment circle down on the ground like this is an awful lot easier.
Is it reused though?
Absolutely.
Would you like one? Well, I'm gonna ask for one.
Joanne?
I've got a somewhat more complex question that probably you're gonna go, it wasn't real. So I'm teaching Shakespeare this semester as ever, as always, and we're doing Macbeth. And of course, I've got a bunch of students who are writing on magic. And one of the things that's interesting is that in the popular culture of the sort of early 16th and 17th century, you get this little flourishing of witchcraft, right? It plays about witchcraft, and of course, James is convinced that he's being cursed by witches. What's the connection between the real life magic and that kind of popular culture fantasy? Or is there?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I can speak to the Macbeth story. So in Macbeth, we have these 3, whatever they are.
Yeah.
We don't really know what they are, and I think that's part of the point. Are they the 3 fates?
Yeah.
They seem to have that kind of power. Are they 3 witches, which they're referred to as weird sisters, or are they fairies? Because fairy women tend to travel in groups of 3. And part of the problem for Macbeth is that he's got no idea which one is which. So there's a fusion of some of these popular myths that come out of fairy lore, which are infused into that, and that's fairly common, as well as some of these other ones. The myths of fairies do find their way into magic. So the magic manual, the Thesaurus Spirituum or Treasury of Spirits, is a late medieval conjuring manual, has fairy conjuring exercises in it, and they're different. Because you don't get them by normal, like conjuring demons. You actually conjure fairies through the kind of this weird play of manners. You make a meal for them, and then you can't talk to them, and then you don't eat their food, and you have to disdain them, and sort of do various kinds of things. And if you conduct this proper play of manners, then you can actually, in this case, get a ring of invisibility and sleep with the best looking fairy. Is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like bottom, right? Yeah.
I've got an online question. I think you just answered part of it, but I'll read it to you. So you mentioned the summoning of demons and angels. Did they target any other types of spirits like fairies? If so, did you find any difference in how the magicians treated these spirits or the courts?
That's such a good question. And I was just actually at a great PhD conference in France this past fall, and in which the student was talking about a late medieval text that I'd spent some time working on, and about like what are these creatures in here, because they're referred to as spirits, and they're treated as if they were demons, but they seem to occupy a kind of middle space. They're actually said, "We're going to send you down to hell if you don't do this." So where are demons? So it's not always clear, right? The implication is clearly that these are demons. Where they are is another question. But other kinds of spirits commonly do appear, as we've mentioned. Fairies appear in there. We sometimes, especially starting in the 16th century, have rituals to conjure ghosts, which is very peculiar indeed, and even to bind ghosts to you. And there are also pygmies and elves and dwarves and various other kinds of terrene spirits that get conjured in various different places in different countries, depending on what your tradition is. For England, it was fairies. So yes, a very good question, a very interesting one, because it's kind of messy. Because in principle, these are good Christians using Christian methods to conjure these spirits, but it's not always quite that way.
I'm interested in the sort of medical magic and the remedies. You mentioned it sort of obliquely, but of course there was also the College of Physicians and one could change professions. But how much did you see evidence of these kind of magical remedies or medical treatments happening at that time?
There's loads of them. There's entire books of collections of charms, and you might find them. Some of the cases that I've worked on, nuns owned them and used them, and there was a sense that when you've gone over the line that it was too magical. But there's a huge gray area in the use of charms, also in combination with the liturgy. So it's hard to tell at which point you sort of drifted into almost heretical magic. But in terms of the medical stuff, every single magic book that I've looked at with Frank, there are medical charms in it. And of course, we're dealing with the Middle Ages and the early modern period. The healing was hard. Staying well was the easiest thing to do to not get sick. So there's a huge number of collections of medical terms. The division between magic is hard to see, and although a lot of the texts that we looked at, we did do healing magic. It doesn't seem that those people end up in the courts very often because they were so necessary. So they weren't really reported because people trusted them and relied on them.
It's a very widespread literature, so you'll even find doctors' books which will include charms. And the charms are very simple things, like it's simply usually a little verbal formula, a little story from the Bible, or it's called a historical little story. Usually accompanied with in the Middle Ages prior to the Reformation by Lord's Prayer, an Ave Maria, and a creed. And some gestures, which would cure toothache or cure epilepsy or various other kinds of ailments. They're very common, very widespread, probably the most widespread form of magic.
I have a couple of questions, but what's the line? What's the heretical line? What constitutes going too far?
Well, okay, so big question. I would doing something like conjuring a demon to dig up buried treasure, you're definitely over the line. There and really in the church court case, it was not so much that they had done it, it's that they tried to convince other people of the efficacy of doing this. So the whole thing with heresy is that it's not only what's going on in your head, but it's the fact that you're drawing other people into error as well. Okay, so a lot of the cases that we look at, the church courts in particular are more concerned with rumor, with the fact that the community is knowing about this. So I think Frank mentioned it, it's that case in Somerset with the women who were charming the cow. There seemed to be a whole group of family, but some of the family would go out into the Mendip Hills on summer's eve at the turn of spring to summer, and they were doing rituals there that were ancient ones, and the church sent out people to catch them because this they did not like. Everybody knew about it, and they were engaging in magic that was suspect at that point. So they get called in, and the way you call them in is you excommunicate them. It's a minor excommunication, though, not a major one. And then so when you show up, they'll correct you, and you might do a little bit of penance. But if you do it again, that's where you start getting into trouble. So our magicians in Yorkshire, they did major penance. There was some public floggings, there was prohibition of opening and using the books that they had looked at, and no more talking about it to other people. Period. So but they were all priests, many of them. So the church took that very seriously.
How long did it, I mean, you've been talking about early modern period. When does it disappear out at some point?
That's Frank's question.
Oh, the cunning folk, I mean, the guy who works on, Owen Davies, who's the cunning folk guy, I mean, goes right on into the 20th century. I mean, and I'm sure there's more than one person in here who knows someone who's wished for water. That's standard practice of cunning folk, and it happens right in this province. The pouring of the wax, a common Ukrainian ritual, that where you have some water, some holy water in a little basin above someone's head, and you pour wax on top of a knife, and then the babka takes the wax lump out and basically divines what the problem is. These are the activities of cunning folk, and it's the same kind of thing. So it's a very current thing. You know, and I think one could imagine other forms of what we call alternate health that would probably fall very much into that category as well. I don't think we can move away from that at all.
So you guys, most of the readings that you kind of researched and looked into for a lot of this, is it mostly European based, or do you find like based on the geographical location, there's more like, say, Northern Europe has a higher concentration of people like angels and are doing particular types of magic and certain locations?
That's yours too. I mean, there's people do magic everywhere, right? But because we're medievalists and early modernists, that's what we look at. But there's certainly magic traditions inside Scandinavia. There's magic traditions in Central America where we've lived for a time. So that it's not just that Europeans were doing this.
And do you find like in a specific location they kind of follow like a common narrative sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, the European material is bound together by the fact that it's a uniformly Christian society, and so it's very, very heavily infused with Christian mythology, the Christian liturgy and the forms and so forth. All of this is very heavily infused. That being said, I mean, I've got a little piece of magical paraphernalia here, which was dug up under a Chinese palace in the 13th century. It has what they call Hindu lettering. It's actually Urdu, I think, but someone will be able to tell me who's better versed in these scripts. But it's a magical square. These magical squares actually were originated in China, traveled to India, went back to India as magic, and came all the way across in through the Middle East and into Europe, and have basically the same form in European magic. So some of this stuff spreads extremely widely. This item here, the Holy Almond Doll, there's a curious archaeology in the name itself. Mandal is from mandala. Okay, so it's a Sanskrit origin, this thing, and that's what this is, which is, and you can pick up things like very much like this in Indian markets today.
Yeah.
Okay. And it found its way through the Arabic world, where it picked up the Arab article al, just the mandala al mandal. And it was eventually imported into Europe. So some of this stuff is international in its spread, quite remarkable the way it transfers. And others of it is like completely localized. So it varies.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Kind of a question that piggybacks on that. You were talking about how some of the 19th century narratives tended to, for explanations of these types of phenomena, tended to ground them in local traditions, but actually the case of their gem magic is something. I'm aware of a few late medieval narratives that connect what I, as kind of a neophyte, would call the magical arts, for lack of a better term, to the Arabic world. And I'm also aware of maybe some later stereotypical representations of magicians as being kind of orientalized, for lack of a better term. Was that part of kind of the self-presentation of anyone that you looked at in this period, given the existence of narratives, or is that something that comes on?
For negative representations of magic in the Middle Ages, they would say, where do you go to study magic? You go to Toledo.
Yeah.
Toledo is the place to go. That's where they know all about that stuff, in part because we've got Jewish and Arabic texts of magic that are being translated exactly in that place. The Iberian Peninsula has just been retaken. That area is retaken. So we've got Christians who speak Arabic and in that area, or and are able to translate all of this material. So some of that, like in a negative sense, or the romance of Eustace the monk, who's this horrible necromancer monk character, rides around on an invisible ship and so forth. It's quite amazing. But he goes to study magic in Toledo in a cave with the devil. Okay. So that's certainly there. They tended, however, to represent the magic as fundamentally Christian, right? For the most part, at least the magic that we're talking about here, the ritual magic, was reformulated in fundamentally Christian terms, in part because that's where the power is. You know, you wouldn't think, well, we're going to take the power of Islam, right? In a Christian context, it's inconceivable. So you completely retool it, turn it into Christian magic. Put some exorcism in there, put Christian prayers in, pull this piece of the liturgy and pull these names of Jesus in, and so forth, and you create a fundamental Christian religion. So for them, as far as the magicians are concerned, this is Christian magic that goes back to people like Solomon in the Old Testament.
Getting in trouble, Sharon. Is it like the poor and working class getting involved before these courts?
Yeah.
Or
Think
which was you just create and kind of do whatever they
See,
want?
full disclosure, Charles and I are on the union still. Yeah, it's the little guys, so, if you're a big shot, you can get into some serious trouble because everyone knows who you are. So John Dee was skirting on the edge of problematic. He was the arch conjurer for Elizabeth, and he moved on very quickly when he needed to. But the poorer people, there's definitely class issues there, especially when you look in the court records. You're generally dealing with people who come from urban guild, lower guilds like barrel makers, cord wingers, those kinds of things. And the cunning folk that they go to are their neighbors who they live with. So and what's interesting is women are much less mobile than the men. So you find cunning men who will have a big circuit that they'll travel on. And cunning women tend to be very neighborhood focused. They're more, in a way, they function like midwives, magical midwives. Yeah.
Seems significant.
Tattoos and medieval magic. Frank gets asked all kinds of questions.
Not that
about
I know of.
tattoos.
Not that I know of. I did get a note on from someone who tattooed himself and was worried about what the tattoo meant.
That's one of those emails.
Do check that out before you do this. So mercifully, it was a very good thing, I could say. It looked like very much like the hieroglyphic mode out of John Dee, which is a kind of a nice symbol of sort of universal harmony, and so it was all right.
Did people make a lot of money doing it?
You could make money. Some of the cases that we've been looking at since we're in a project on a third book now, it's clear that this was the way people made their living. And so the ones that we know of that made the most money, unfortunately, were the charlatans. They were people like Wisdom, who fleeced poor young Harry Neville, who just didn't want to be married, hoped his dad would die, so he could inherit his fortune. There was Robert Allen, who we didn't talk about, who unfortunately for him predicted the death of the king, which was Edward. at the time, and this is how he ended up being arrested. But he seemed to have made quite a lot of money. But one of the things that particularly male magicians, male cunning folks seem to have done is lived in the homes of their noble patrons and that make the things for them that they needed. So this is kind of their homes added. So I don't have any cases of women that are doing that. I think that if you're a professional cunning woman, you're not going to lower your value in your community by living in the home of someone and seeming to be the kind of woman you need to live with. So
What makes you a charlatan versus a legitimate magician?
well, yes. I think there are a lot of people who are legitimate magicians in the Middle Ages, but the charlatan one, it seems to be, kind of a jack of all trades. So I come back to wisdom, right? I mean, he eventually became a doctor. We have a couple that did that though, who they have fake licenses and we got caught and the fake license would be confiscated from them. But of course, it's the late Middle Ages, the early modern period, so there's no good way to track people. And we would find them in the courts turning up having been licensed as a physician somewhere else, in a different county. But so the charlatan is really how many times you end up in court, the kinds of cases you end up in court, and how much money is involved in that you're getting for things like gambling. I'm making rings that I can give to young nobles who will gamble, who will help them win, or rings that will help them get their girlfriends to,
Like more exploitative almost?
Yes.
I think we could even go one step further. I mean, there are two cases. One was the William Neville case that we read. Another is actually another young nobleman, also Neville. Harry Neville. We talked about William Neville is
They were related.
in the case of Harry Neville, it's quite clear that from the records that wisdom was manipulating him like crazy. That he wasn't getting anything out of it, and then there's a fair amount. If you read, we've got the full confession in there, and it's quite clear that he got taken for a ride. That wisdom was in cahoots with one of Neville's servants, and they were just constantly, taking advantage of him all the way along. You can just see it in the sources. With the William Neville case, it seems probably that most of what was going on, that they were simply making stuff up, completely falsely. That being said, it's quite clear that many of the magic practices, including some of the things we see here, it's quite possible to provoke subjectively convincing experiences when you do this. What's going on, that's between you and your theologian. But this item here, if you want to go online and do a search on almond doll in my name, you'll find a video of this device working with candles burning and incense coming up from around it. It's quite beautiful and remarkable thing. And one could imagine that it would be possible to talk to an angel in this kind of thing, or that someone, in the right state, breathing in enough frankincense might have the kinds of experiences that would be convincing. So I think there are levels upon which you've always got to allow that people who are on the up and out. There's lots of evidence for that.
I have one more online question. Is the difference between real magicians and charlatans? Sorry. Second here. It was taken back. Any other questions?
Well,
See a couple other scrolls on the table. I don't know, did you have a chance to explain those, or did I miss something?
These are just a few items. This is actually a reproduction of an apotropaic, or a scroll, basically a scroll to keep away misfortune that was made for me by a student in one of my classes, and she very generously let me keep it. Written in quite a passable English secretary hand.
Yeah.
Right. This one is the real deal. This is an Ethiopian scroll that was given to me. This is actually, you can buy these in Ethiopia. It's written in Guz in Ethiopic. And this is exactly what it's for. It's apotropic. It's to keep it contains scripture verses and so forth, and it's meant to keep evil away. You just carry it around on you. There's no one to walk off with it. So a few other items here, if you're interested. This is it doesn't really enter into our magic, but this is the Sigillum Dei, which comes from, or Sigil of God, which comes from the Sworn Book of Honorius, and prior to that to the Liber Sacer. This is meant for various kinds of purposes. John Dee, a mid-16th or late 16th century magician and cartographer and so forth, and familiar of Elizabeth's court, used to scry angels, and he used it as a sort of holy spot that he could put his conjuring device, and he used a crystal into which his scryer looked. So that's what this one is.
Okay, they've resubmitted their question. Is the difference between real magicians and charlatans whether the magic practitioner believed in the magic they profess to practice?
I would say yes.
That's a good way.
I think that, yeah.
Makes sense.
I think it's a very good, that's what it boils down to.
We probably have time for one or two more questions, if anybody has any.
You mentioned that lots of like other types of magic were converted to like Christian focused. Did you ever encounter like the reverse at all in any of your explorations?
Yes, it happens. I don't know about material that's converted to, if material is important from Christian or context into Islamic context, but I do know that there are charms for the three wise men that are important to Jewish magic in the Middle Ages. So we have some very peculiar importations that you figure like what a peculiar thing for to be picked up in a Jewish context. The three wise men that traveled to the birth of Jesus, but evidently there was something compelling about this. So there is evidence for transfer there, as well as of course in the other direction. So interesting question.
Is there anything more you'd like to say before we wrap things up?
Just thank you to everybody for coming. It's so nice to see so many friends.
And for some terrific questions.
Yeah, really.
Fabulous.
Thank
Really
you.
enjoyed it.
I'd like to say a quick thank you to Sharon and Frank again for being with us tonight. They will be sticking around to sign some books. And of course, we have copies of Everyday Magicians and The Magic of Rogues for sale on that table there. For our virtual guests, copies are available to purchase online at mcnallyrobinson.com. You're welcome to get your copies signed before you purchase them. Just make sure to stop at the cash desk on your way out. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you for supporting these local authors. Have a great evening.
Yes, you're lovely. Wonderful, this is right. Yes.